Da skal vi ha en sekvens som handler om finansiering av sosialt entreprenørskap. Vi skal ha 3 stykker. Det er ikke meg.
Det er bare litt brå overgang. Ja, nei.
Ja. Jo. Jeg er glad det ikke er meg, ja. Vi skal ha en sekvens, ja, hvor vi skal snakke om finansiering av sosialt entreprenørskap og nye modeller for det. Rent konkret skal vi ta utgangspunkt i noe som heter social impact bonds, som er en måte å finansiere det på. Men alle disse ordningene har det til felles at det tar sikte på å utløse mer tradisjonell risikokapital til sosiale prosjekter, og hvor betalingen i større grad enn i dag er knyttet til det sosiale utkommet som faktisk skjer. Så man får rett og slett penger for å få til ting. Om andre ord, jo bedre sosiale resultater, jo bedre blir det avkastningen for de som investerer i det. Det er stort sett konseptet og prinsippet som ligger til grunn for denne måten å finansiere det på. Vi skal ha et panel her av 3 mennesker. Den ene er Arthur Wood, som er en av foregangspersonene innenfor denne måten å tenke på. Han er partner i noe som heter Total Impact Advisors. Har en lang historie bak seg med sosialt entreprenørskap. Jobbet i USA, i Sveits, UK, gift med en norsk kone. Johan Andresen, som alle kjenner. Og også Annika Tverin fra Social Finance, som skal gi en presentasjon. Så hvis de bare kommer inn, så skal dette her gå videre i programmet. Så... Vi skal snakke sammen etterpå. Først skal vi få en presentasjon av Annika Tverin om et helt konkret prosjekt hvor denne finansieringsmodellen ligger til grunn, nemlig om social impact bonds in the criminal justice sector i Storbritannia. Annika er da multilingvist, så født i Finland som svensktalende, så vil dette da skje på svensk, og så vil vi da fortsette samtalen her på engelsk etterpå.
Vi snakker på engelsk nå.
Du snakker på engelsk? Ja, det er nytt for meg. Vi tar det på engelsk.
Ja, god eftermiddag, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's very pleased to be here and to hear about all the exciting projects that are on the ground in Norway. I'm here to present today the social impact bond. Let's see if we can get the presentation up here. So, social finance was actually set up as a sort of corporate finance house or bank that works in the sector for social enterprises and social organizations. And what we want to do every day when we get up in the morning is think about how we can attract capital and more appropriate capital for social entrepreneurs and for addressing social problems. And part and parcel of this exercise was really to innovate in terms of financial structures. And the work started in 2008, 2009, and in 2010 we launched the first social impact bond in Peterborough, in the Peterborough prison. And the issue that we were trying to deal with is reoffending rates among short-sentenced male prisoners. In the UK, that is a very high rate. The reoffending rate is about 60%. So you go into the prison, you come out of the prison, and 60% of the time you go back into the prison. So I have a few slides here. I will just try to go through them in a very sort of systematic manner. We'll start with the theory behind the social impact bond. It's called a social impact bond, but it's actually a hybrid instrument. So I apologize for this financial English, but I'll try to explain that. It's not a bond, it's not an obligation, it's really more high risk than that. It's almost like a share, it has an equity type risk structure. But before the bankers came in, the word impact bond stuck, and so that's what we call it today. It's an investment, so it's not about grants where you actually have a minus 100% return. This is about trying to recover the capital and a return on top of that. But the crucial element to this is that actually it's an investment to deliver social change. So only if you create social change will you actually see the money flow back to the investors. The second point here is that you actually have three parties contracting. You have two contracts. On the one hand, you have the public sector, what we call in the English language a commissioner. That can be a Minister of Justice, which it was in this case in the Peterborough prison, but it can also be a city or a commune, a municipality. And the government will calculate, or together with the people who are developing the bond, the value of trying to prevent a particular social problem. And in this case, it was the reoffending of these prisoners. And part of the value that's created is then going to be paid out if a successful outcome is created to the investors. If there is no improvement in the social outcome, there will be no payment by the government. So in some ways, what you're actually talking about is enabling governments, and I know that Norway is a very wealthy state, but in other areas in Europe and in the United Kingdom in particular, it's a way for the government to invest in preventing social ills, because they normally don't have a lot of money for that, because they're spending everything on acute care. So that's why this is quite interesting from the government's point of view. They're able to try to prevent social ills from happening 5, 10 years down the line. The third point I'm bringing up here is on the back of this contract that you're negotiating with the commissioner, with the public service, you will then go to investors, and that's where the second contract is agreed, and you will raise capital from these investors. And these investors will take on board the risk that social outcomes aren't actually realized. The investors are outside the public sector. They can be philanthropists, they can be trusts and foundations, they could even be you and I, but we are not really quite that far along the road yet. Point number 4 then is that the money that you raise, you then invest in programs on the ground to ensure that you do your utmost to prevent the social ills from occurring. And once your improvements are measured on the ground, then money will flow back to the investors. So you have actually a risk transfer from the government to the investor, and the investor will get more of a return the better the social outcome is. There may be some caps on this, and we will see that in our example. So if we look at the social impact bond that we launched in 2010, it was contracted with the Minister of Justice, so they were the commissioner, and it raised £5 million from 17 investors. 5 of these were high net worth individuals, so wealthy individuals with an interest in trying to do some social good. 12 of them were trusts and foundations who have in their social mission the intention to try to address problems in criminal justice. And what's really the problem then that you're trying to address? Well, in the UK, as I indicated, if you go into prison on a short sentence, on a short sentence that's less than 12 months, you have a 60% likelihood of actually reoffending as soon as you get out of the prison again. And there is no probation service, there's no service from the government for this population. So our target population are male prisoners in sentences less than 12 months. They also, when they get out, they only get about £47 in their pocket. It takes 3 weeks before any benefits kick in. And so many of these prisoners just go into the habits they had prior to being sent into the prison. They may have problems, they're sleeping rough, they may have substance abuse problems, they may not have a family to go to, they have no job to go to in many cases. And so what we've done then is try to design a program on the ground where you're looking at what kinds of services does this target population need in order to actually not reoffend? So the actual program is 3,000 prisoners over a period of 6 years. It takes about a year for 500 prisoners to be released from the Peterborough prison, and then they will go through the program that we've designed. And at the end of a 2-year period, when 1,000 prisoners have been let out of the prison, there's a 12-month monitoring period where you can see whether they have actually committed a crime or not, and another 6 months when they're convicted in the criminal justice system. So you actually have a population of 1,000 prisoners monitored for 4 years, and another set of 1,000 prisoners monitored from year 2 onward to year 6, and then from year 4 to year 8. So in terms of the actual program, it's 6 years in length, and the payment period for the investors will be up to 8 years. We can look at the schematic here, but I wanted to talk a little bit about the returns. Normally, when you look at social entrepreneurs and grant making, the return to whoever makes the investment, the grant, is minus 100%. In this instance, we've agreed a contract whereby if there is a 10% improvement in the rate of reoffending, i.e. the reoffending drops, then the investor would gain a 7.5% IRR, internal rate of return. It's an annualized return. If your improvement is actually better than that, then you can get to 13 or 14% IRR. And the payment obviously comes from the government, who has then been able to improve the social outcomes. There's also the possibility, though, that actually the investors will not gain anything at all. So here we're talking about a payment profile or a return profile of between minus 100% and 13, 14% positive return. So what is it that this innovation really does on the ground? Why is it quite interesting? Well, as I indicated, there are 3 different constituencies. At the top, there are the investors. They're motivated by trying to see how innovation could actually help us understand how to address these social problems. And of course, if they are able to get their capital or even more, then they can reinvest that money. And secondly, for the government, it's a risk transfer. It enables the government to actually invest in prevention of social ills. And for the service providers, who are essentially you in the United Kingdom, in Peterborough, it's a way of actually having financed revenue and programs for 6 years. Because if you do your job, you know that you're going to be able to be on the ground and continue to do your good work. So visibility of revenues and your sort of programs that you've designed, and it's all for 6 years on the ground. So I think that concludes my introduction to the social impact bond in Peterborough. Areas where we think that this could be applicable and where we're working hard is actually on children on the verge of going into foster care, which is very expensive for cities and municipalities, and at the same time the social outcomes are not good at all. Thank you.
Thank you, Annika. We'll have the opportunity to follow up on your presentation in a bit. First, Arthur, you have been one of the key champions for sort of rethinking the way social finance works today. Why do you think it's so necessary to change the incentive schemes and the incentive mechanisms for those kinds of
I have to say, working in this sector is the perfect job for a manic depressive. You come to events like this and you see absolutely brilliant social entrepreneurs with brilliant innovative ideas. And then on the flip side of the equation, you'll walk across the corridor and you'll go to another presentation, And you'll see the costs of global warming, 5.4 trillion. You'll see the costs of sanitation, $600 billion annually. Road safety, 600 billion. Now, I've only picked 3. I bet there's another 20 in the audience here. And then you look at the financing system behind that. Now, I'll leave the government out of this for the time being. I'll happily come back to it. But let me just look at the private sector solution. The total amount of US foundation endowments is about what the US military spends in 1 year. That is unaligned. 98% of those assets are unaligned with social mission. We then take 5% of that, and that is then allocated in one financial tool invented in 1903 called a foundation. And that is the mechanism that we allocate 98% of that capital. It creates a marketplace that is unleveraged, unannuitized. And what do I mean by that? You're essentially spending, as social entrepreneurs, 50% of your time trying to raise your annual capital every year. It means for the government that is short of capital, you're in a very inefficient capital market, not only as a capital market, which you should be concerned about as a government, but when you source product into the social sector, it is fragmented. And to the corporate sector, it is somehow still far more acceptable to make money out of sex, drugs, and rock and roll rather than solving the fundamental issues of our time. So we've created our own poverty trap, and we are locked in a financial structure that dates back to 1903. And it's time we fast-forwarded and applied the tools of modern capitalism to solving some of these fundamental issues. And if we do not, the costs in terms of all the issues I've just mentioned are absolutely unsolvable. We have to move from a pre-capitalist world to actually working out how we can leverage capital for social good. And the social impact bonds is a classic example of how to do that.
Johan, this also means that you introduce you introduce 2 things at least. You introduce a monetary value on a social outcome, and you introduce the idea of making a profit on social entrepreneurism. Do you think that is acceptable in a Norwegian society?
The first part, yes. The second part, I don't know. But I think if you do the first part, if you actually, as I said this morning, if we can prove that we are creating value, social value, social good, and that has an income factor and it has a cost factor, and sometimes both, and sometimes one or the other. That's our first goal, and that's the perhaps most important. And then if we can do that, and take it the next step and say, well, if we are spending all this time and money, could we share in some of the positive outcomes, which the government otherwise would have to spend a whole lot of money on, our taxpayers' money, to remedy, to fix, instead of fixing up front. So the answer is yes, I hope so. This is going to be difficult, extremely, much more so than in perhaps the UK, where you're in dire straits already, so you're desperate for new mechanism. Actually, like this goes for all of Europe. We're not desperate yet, because we have the money, we're just not spending it the right way, and that's a different story. Here you're actually talking about raising money that is not in the government hands, not in the public hands, but is held by private investors looking for new ways to make a difference, and also perhaps protect their capital. So it's a long way. It's a longer way here than perhaps elsewhere, but it can be done.
Annika, you've actually one of the few who managed to sort of realize a project based on this kind of financing. What are the main obstacles in realizing it?
Well, I think the social impact bond, as Arthur was alluding to, is just one example of where you're actually looking at measuring the social impact and actually having a payment by result type of structure. So you're really looking at the outcomes and the positive social effect you're having as the most central thing that you're trying to do. In terms of the social impact bond, you need to have 3 different criteria that actually would work. One is you need to have the public sector willing to contract and have this type of an arrangement put in place. and they need to have cashable savings. So in the example where I talked about children on the verge of going to foster care, it is very expensive for municipalities in the UK to pay for that service. And so this would be one area where we think that the social impact bond technology could be applied. And I think the third sort of requirement is that if you are going to make interventions and have a social program on the ground, as in Peterborough, you need to make sure that there's a very close relationship between those interventions that you do and the social outcomes that you're measuring, because otherwise you can't make the case that there's a relationship and you should be paid for it.
Can I pick up that point about that there is a whole range of financial innovation in this marketplace. And if you think of this in product terms, and I'm sorry to sound like a banker, but in essence, if you think the Acumen Fund, which some of you are, is the application of a fund management model. Social impact bonds is the application of structured product. For those of you that walk into Starbucks tomorrow and see Starbucks saying how wonderfully environmentally friendly they are, that is due to a chap called Ron Layton, who has injected intellectual property into the relationship with Starbucks that triples the incomes of farmers, added 150, 200 million to farmers, potentially revolutionary model. There are a whole range of these types of models. We launched a program in Ashoka back in 2008, specifically around what we call social investment entrepreneurs. So what you are seeing is a range of these models. Some of them are quite mature. I mean, the application of microfinance is the application of a commercial banking technique. We'll hear about venture capital, social venture capital, and social PE from the EVPA. So some of these models are certainly more mature than the other, but you're seeing a growing trend of these types of tools being injected in the marketplace. And the opportunity of social impact bonds is that, in essence, it creates a multi-stakeholder relationship. And the word multi-staker partnership is used far too much in our space. What this mechanism gives you the ability to do is to have different players taking different economic social return over a life cycle. And that's potentially revolutionary. And I want to take one of the points that you made. The critical part about this structure is the quicker and more effective you as a social entrepreneur deliver that solution, the higher the IRR. So there is no fundamental contradiction between making money and doing good. And the opportunity is in the very inefficiency of how we currently operate.
I mean, in your experience, does this argument also resonate with the current social entrepreneurs who might be funded, I mean, quite differently through projects or grants? Or
absolutely. I mean, I formed with my partner John Simon and two others, Total Impact Advisors, and the reason we did that is that we saw from both the governmental side and when I was working at Ashoka that social entrepreneurs would reach a particular size and then face major difficulties in scaling. So there's huge innovation in our sector. The real critical question is then how you scale them further. And it's actually more complex than a straight VC model. You have to learn how to blend government spending with venture capital, with the disciplines of investment banking. And that's a real need, because if we're going to scale these really innovative models we've seen today, you've got to begin to think how you blend these different sources of capital, where different players take different economic social return over the product life cycle.
Johan, you don't have to commit here now, but I mean, you have allocated, I mean, quite substantial funds, right, for the current social entrepreneur schemes. You've also been sort of spearheading microfinance in Norway. I will argue that case, right? Will this be sort of your next venture to start pushing for?
Well, I've challenged, I think, I don't know if Tom Erik is still in the audience, the guy in charge of alternative investments at FERD. They have quite a large allocation, which are dedicated to non-social investments. But I think it's, the question is, would I do it could I do it in the UK? I mean, you know, if all lives have equal worth, it wouldn't really matter to me whether I did it there or somewhere else. So do I believe in the model? Yes, absolutely. Would I be willing to invest in it? Probably. Do I think it's, would I spend a lot of time trying to introduce it in Norway? I don't know if my life is that long. you can ask the politicians when they come on next whether they're willing to put their head forward. If they put their head on my money, maybe it'll work. But I think it takes both actually. But the money's there. I mean, there's no doubt about it.
But knowing the investor community, you also believe that it would free up funds for these kind of investments, right? Which currently goes to more traditional.
I think so. I think there's a lot of we call stiftelser and different types of funds, and that could actually do it. And I think there's a lot of wealthy individuals who would like the mix between the return and the social good, and who thinks microfinance in India is too far away.
I mean, you ultimately see this as almost an alternative stock market, right? Where you can securitize some of these concepts and then almost make a stock out which people can trade in.
Let me take that. Let me marry both of those responses together. One of the problems for the banks, and I speak with the SCARs, having dealt with them for 8 years on this, is that there is no replicable business. What, in essence, we do on each of these projects is we design within a for-profit, not-for-profit environment fairly complex legal structures, and they have to be complex. I mean, in social impact bonds case, I think you spent, 400,000 pro bono in terms of putting the structure together. And that means these models are not replicable, and certainly a social entrepreneur in Horton, if he understands it, is going to have difficulty in replicating that. So the extent to which we can actually create mechanisms that are quick, easy, and replicable. And I think on a positive note, some of the new emerging legal structures that are emerging, when married to these types of structures, begins to give you, and I believe this will be the next step, begins to give you the ability to create securities that are standard and common and could certainly be traded on a stock exchange. Because if you think about the social impact bond, essentially what you are doing is there is a nice cash flow coming from government that could be securitized. What I mean by that is that somebody is prepared to give money against an obligation coming from the government. And that would then trade as a function of the achievement of the social metric. So you could see a whole range of competing, as you do in a normal market, whole range of competing securities in terms of the impact they create.
However much I'd love to continue this conversation, we're sort of running out of time. One final one for you, Annika. Do you see yourself as a businesswoman or as a social entrepreneur?
I think I'm both. I'm trying to be bilingual in both. I mean, I come from myself from a banking background, so that's perhaps more natural language. But I think the whole concept of trying to do a social good at the same time as you support a business model is completely compatible with our society at the moment, and really actually should be the way we look at capitalism, that you could add a third dimension to the risk-return two-dimensional model, and that third dimension would be social effect of your actions.
Can I add one thing? I realise it's time out.
It's time out, but it's quick. Yeah.
I pose to you the question. We have spent $183 billion in sub-Saharan Africa since 1970, 50% of all African expenditure. We lose 50% in the allocation process. Of the remaining 50%, 80% is estimated to disappear out as flight capital, which leaves you with 10 to 20% on the ground, which is administrated by small fragmented organizations, and I include the UN in that category, small fragmented organizations that are not incentivized to work together. That system is untenable. We need to change the incentives to collaborate and scale.
And with that appeal, thank you very much.